Steam's global position is a little bit under threat, right? And this is pretty interesting. It's going to be pretty impactful for Valve. So if you've been using Steam, you may have noticed that there's a few more games coming online from China. Some excellent things. Black Myth Wukong's one we've been talking about a lot. One that's on Steam right now, the Dyson Sphere game, people are absolutely loving. People also noticing, a bunch of Mandarin comments in the Steam reviews. So there is this population in China who are using Steam. And to a lot of people, that might seem a little bit strange, right? A little bit like, oh, I didn't think they were allowed to use that. I didn't think it worked like that. Yeah, actually. And that might be a part of why the Steam that we know and use kind of disappeared in China.
Sort of, almost, yes.
Yes,
it's complicated.
Quite a funny little story. So for a quick little recap here, Steam is bizarre in China. So Steam China is different to the Steam that we use. Steam China exists in a beta form that is heavily limited. Basically, it's limited to government-approved games only, and it's a joint endeavor with Perfect World. Now, Perfect World, if that rings a bell, you're right. They are not to be confused with Perfect World Entertainment, though. Perfect World Entertainment were the North American subsidiary of Perfect World, but that subsidiary was purchased by Embracer Group, who are gobbling up everything. Seriously, Embracer Group are totally going under the radar, and people generally have no idea. It's quite wild. So people then were a bit concerned when Steam China was announced and then released. And obviously, I don't know what people were talking about in China, but if you're a Chinese PC gamer, Steam China is a humongous downgrade for you if you're forced to use it, because in China you could actually get complete unfettered access to all of the stuff on Steam that we see. But of course, that is not how it goes in China, right? For console and mobile games, they need to be government approved in order to be published. So really, it is quite a miracle that Steam was tolerated to exist for so long.
Yeah, it's very much described as the grey market, and Epic actually exists with the Epic Game Store in the same capacity, where it clearly goes against what the Chinese government want for games. It's just they haven't actually stopped it yet. So It is just, these are still here, but the question is to everyone, for how long?
Yes, and the disappearing happened on Christmas Day. Access to Steam's store page went down in China. The client and API were still accessible, but the store page itself was gone. Here's the initial reporting from SteamDB. Now, for the people who are actually still doing, their job with the news, I suppose, over Christmas, the prevailing opinion was that they accidentally banned the store page but didn't mean anything by it, or that they banned it as a precursor to a full Steam ban. But then, new info came to light that it may not have been a ban. This is where it's quite interesting. So, there's a DNS cache poisoning attack causing some players in China not to be able to access Steam's store page. This happened during the beginning of the winter sale. This is being confused for an alleged Steam ban in the country. The last attack happened before 2017's winter sale as well. So, quite interesting. Basically, it appears this was a DNS cache poisoning attack that directed Steam Store visitors to a Facebook IP address.
Which, of course, is obviously banned in China.
Yes. Now, one of the blocking methods of the Great Firewall, right, is DNS poisoning. So it is still technically a possibility this was a government action, but it's much more likely to have been a malicious attack or a mistake.
Yeah, that is, if it was, in fact, the DNS cache poisoning. Yeah. Then that would make sense that it could be government, but more likely to be something else. But we have a little bit more information.
Yeah, so we do have one Chinese Reddit user suggesting that it's not DNS poisoning, that instead it is intermittent access rather than a full countrywide block, and that this is indicative of how the Great Firewall actually operates. Here's a quote. "The current situation is imposed probabilistic packet loss according to host name leaked by TLS SNI." Now, so basically they suggest that there is a flaw using curl resolve. You can fake a host name, which then forces the Great Firewall to impose packet loss regardless of where your traffic is actually going, provided it is, of course, an intentional government action. We cannot verify this because we're outside of China, funny enough. But if it is true, then that is some interesting evidence towards it being an intentional ban.
Yeah, it's interesting because, this being just one Chinese Reddit user, you kind of look and go, well, obviously there is no proof of any of this whatsoever. but it is like one person who's countering all of the existing narrative. So like everyone's kind of like, it's probably a ban because it makes sense that it's a ban. You know, where there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing going on there. But then there's also the, oh, well, if it's a DNS cache poisoning attack, like we saw in the 2017 Winter Sale, it's just a malicious actor. But then this person's going and going, no, it's very sensible to read it both these ways, but the fact that people can still access and others can't is something that the Great Firewall does. And given the fact that that person has a history of network development and stuff, I just went through their Reddit account. I'm inclined to think that's a decent possibility. Everything they've said does line up.
Balls in play.
Basically, yeah. Yeah.
Now, the implications of this are actually quite large. Quite large for a lot of people, including, game developers and publishers in the West. And that does, of course, impact players. Yep. So what if Steam does get banned? Well, according to Daniel Ahmad back in 2019, Steam had about 40 million users in the mainland alone. That's a lot of people playing games that are on Western Steam. He also said there's about 2,000 games there localized for China. Now, in the indie sphere, Chinese localization is a pretty hot topic. Micros and No More Robots are one success story, though. Descenders saw 30% of its sales being from Chinese users in a 12-month period. That's a lot of sales. Now, I imagine that is sales, not revenue. So there could be, some important differences there, but that still is a pretty damn major thing. Now, the developer of Defender's Quest also had an interesting blog post on his basically his explosion in revenue from localization. Yeah, as well. And the read there is there's a lot of people in China and they want to play video games. Actually, unsurprisingly, the same reasons we like games. Games are great. They want to play games, and I suppose from their perspective, they have all the restrictions on their phone games. They have got to wait for government approvals for some of the games. There's just, they have such a limit. They have so much more restrictions. And if you can just go access Western Steam, that must be incredible if you're gaming in China. Yeah, Steam is just this great big frontier for them to have unfettered access to whatever they want. And the only real barrier then is, realistically, it's Chinese localization. Yeah. Which obviously you can get around that a little bit, but it's their English proficiency is ranked 49 out of 112 countries because they're so, just sort of removed from the West, as opposed to how so many Europeans grow up and know English, or even the Swedes, they all learn English, and as an example. Yeah, I mean, there's so many Europeans I know that actually learned English generally from engaging with online Western stuff, but also they would kind of, because they were kids, they would naturally pick up English from playing games in English. So it's obviously the Chinese haven't been able to do that, but there's a massive untapped market. It's just if you put the money down to localize, then you have access to that market. And that's what happened with the Defender's Quest guy. It was very much just, okay, so there's Chinese sales. I see a lot of Chinese comments in my game saying they want a localization. You know what? I'm not going to localize everything, but I'll localize the gameplay important stuff. Yeah. Not all the dialogue. And then did that, and I was oh, and now the highest revenue I have is from China. There's cool. Some games that it's pretty inexpensive to do localization for. Yeah. We were running over some numbers. We are not one of those games. We have far too many words. So it's a very interesting thing, the whole localization side. And yeah, look, if your game can be reasonably localized, and it seems like a game that would be a fit for the Chinese market, you can get a lot of sales. Which then, of course, means what if Steam goes? Because if this is a ban, I mean, that's 40 million users as of 2019. It's bound to be quite a good few million more by now. Sure. So this is at minimum 40 million users locked out of tens of thousands of games. That is a lot of customers. That's a lot of potential revenue. So that's going to be a big suck for the industry on both sides of the ban. It's going to suck for the Chinese gamers. It's going to, it could actually be kind of annoying for some of the Chinese publishers. Of course, yeah. As well, for, getting their games out there. It's going to basically suck for everyone, right? Less customers, less money changing hands, and kind of keeps the whole thing going. So yeah, and look, the thing there is, the barrier to being approved is pretty high. It takes a lot of time. It's just a pain in the ass. Get your game approved by the government for sale. Then a lot of localization decisions are based on seeing demand and trends and then capitalizing on them. Of course, that's there's a little bit of the market being improved, so then you commit the capital to that. Yeah. It's very different to, as you say, it being blind. Yeah, and now you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to go and pay for, getting the localization done.
You're going to pay for any changes that you'd think it'll need to get approved. Then you need to take the organizational time out to go get it approved. And then it could release and nobody in China could want it. Whereas right now you could arguably go through the process to get on Steam China if you really wanted, but you would at least be able to see what actual Chinese Steam users are engaging with your game as the minute. So it's that kind of thing where it's just, it's basically just crippling the industry over there.
Yeah, then there's another thing which, you can sort of see some of this go on in Hollywood as an example, but obviously a part of getting your game approved is the cultural criteria. One of the recent things that popped up for that was like effeminate men.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
maybe they'll find that people like Graha too much in FF and just ban the game. Who knows? But, there's obviously a lot of cultural criteria and sort of things, boxes you've got to tick in order to be approved. Even look at the differences between World of Warcraft China and World of Warcraft West, right? They're pretty different. So this does mean, obviously, that the government policy is going to have, it's going to impact kinds of games that go on that can get made. A really good example of this, actually, that almost happened, I believe, was Rainbow Six Siege.
Oh, yes.
Remember, they're going to remove gambling from the maps because the Chinese government was throwing a wee fit over it.
Yeah, that's right.
Because obviously they don't want to have any of those less savory cultural elements being there in the same way. Is it Game for Peace?
Oh, yeah, Game for Peace, where no one dies. Yeah.
Yeah, so their battle royale game is Game for Peace. It's like, come on. Come on. You're not fooling anyone.
Yeah.
Some of the death animations. They're not death animations.
Yeah, they don't die.
They're very funny. They're very funny. But, obviously there's some worries there. And, you would very much hope that it doesn't impact the games that we get in the West. I certainly don't want any of that shit.
Yeah, that's...
Right? Like, I want a level in a casino.
Yeah, that's where you get to obviously there's the bigger cultural things where they're going to be like, okay, you can't have like any of these things. There's the representation things. Well, you can't have anyone being like gay or whatever because that'll be it. Just straight up no. There's that stuff, but then there's also like the smaller things where if you think about horror games as an example, if you're thinking, well, I'm going to make an indie horror game and I want the widest market possible, but I do want it to be it's a wide enough appeal horror game to any horror fan, but I do want to release in China because that's a pretty decent market for horror stuff. I guess I'll just have to completely neuter all of these elements. So like no skeletons, undead stuff's a bit generally weird over there culturally. So you have to, and then if you're thinking that from the get-go, from the start, then you'll never bother putting any of those elements in. And then you just have this like kind of strangling of creative freedom because this 40 million market has the access revoked unless you do it.
Well, what's quite funny then actually is, if that entire process... Basically, if you cut off the 40 million, and then what could end up happening, this would ultimately be the people who would lose out the most here would be gamers in China. And they could find themselves just cut off, and then developers in the West not really bothering to get their stuff over. So they basically lose access to the basically like the kind of free market. As in, there's less restrictions on the sorts of content that can be there in the games. So they could just lose access to all that shit. Have a vastly inferior replacement, and that would obviously suck for them. Yeah,
and the one thing that I think is interesting is because I think people kind of go, oh, well, the Chinese have a different taste in games anyway, so maybe it's okay for us because we don't want some of that influence coming over because they're a new market. They'll change what we like. People will start catering for them, not as a government set of rules, but as just a natural cultural difference thing. And then you kind of go, well, that's sort of kind of fair, but also it's worse if they're cut off because they're so large, then those government things will come into action. And it's almost like, they'll never see the good stuff that the West does. And then if it goes this way, I'm like trying to think like 10, 20 years into the future for the industry, they'll come out at the end and they'll only have known what the government has let them know. And then it'll be like a weird kind of culture shock thing. And then you'll have these like really different games, which can be good in a way, but I can see how people will be like fearful of like, it's culture elements bleeding across in ways that they're not really a fan of, versus when you look at like Black Myth Wukong, where that is very, very much very like Western sensibility. Those devs have been playing really modern action games from the West because you can tell all the influences, but also they're bringing their own little unique thing. The whole journey to the West in the unique way they're telling it. So I think that's like a really kind of cool version of how that like cross-culture like sort of bleeding in can happen. But if it's just walled off, it's going to be like a sharper, worse version.
Yeah.
And it's just going to suck for everyone.
It'd be really shitty if it does go down like that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many aspects of like Chinese culture that are really cool.
Yep.
Right? Like, I mean, just that. That's a setting that I like in games.
Yeah.
You know, the aspects of myth and history that I greatly enjoy. And it would be a terrible shame if, well, you know, if it all goes south and we don't get cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even if the ban is like, because obviously right now it's only affecting the Steam store page, so anyone who has games on Steam in China can still work away. They can still access the client, download the games, play, etc., etc. But it's like, it'll just, if it gets bad, it's obviously you can argue, okay, VPN stuff, you can just VPN and play whatever. There's ways around the Great Firewall, but then how much of a portion of the 40 million users will that get rid of? Because it's another step. And it's also a step of evading the Great Firewall, which I'm sure the government will be very happy with you doing.
Yeah, I mean, what happens if they end up being able to find that out? And maybe, you know, there's a penalty for doing it or something like that.
Your social credit score disappears.
Yeah, obviously, right? Not good shit. Not good. So, there you go. Something's going on with Steam in China. We have one pretty convincing sounding Reddit user.
Yep.
We also have a lot of other comment. Right now, we cannot tell exactly what's going on, but I think quite a few people in the industry will be watching this quietly, but with a good degree of worry.
Yeah, I mean, I actually did see a couple of developers be really afraid because they're like, we haven't released the game, but we've got Chinese localization sorted, or we're working on it, or we were planning on it, and it was part of all of our all of our plans and funding and stuff was getting the Chinese localization. Does this mean like I'm completely shit out of luck? And the only response is, can't tell you. Sorry, nobody knows.
Like, I mean, for an example, you know, localization is something that we've been discussing with our game right now. Yeah. We have quite a lot of freedom, I guess, within our, just within us being published, right? We have a decent bit of freedom in how all of that works. And it's the sort of thing our publisher does narrative games. They understand that we have a pretty fucking massive script, so we can't just go around translating it willy-nilly. But there's a lot of other games where, you know, they might actually in their contract have like, okay, we want this game out in, I don't know, I'll pick from a hat. I'll just say German, Spanish, and Chinese, or Mandarin, say. That could be a spanner in the works. Not just for the dev, also for the publisher.
Of course.
I mean, hey, maybe you just have to cancel it and the money goes elsewhere. Who knows? But yeah, so suffice to say, this is not something that will really have a strong first-order impact on just about anybody watching this video. But it could be other little things that, you know, you won't really notice, but they will happen and they will impact you. Just the sort of thing you never, you don't know what you didn't have. You don't know what you don't know. Yeah. And I guess it's kind of like the guardrails of the industry. Sometimes you don't know what's outside the guardrails because the rails are there.
Yep.
So that's that. Right. Let us know what you think. And certainly if you've got any insight on what could really be going on here, we'd love to hear that too.
Oh, please, yes.
See you later.